Hello everyone and welcome back to Teachers Talk Money, where I help teachers master their money in order to give back to themselves. I'm so excited for today's video because this is one of my favorite videos I do all year, and it is where I detail every single dollar that I spent for the entire year. I did this last year and it was so enlightening to see my actual numbers. And now I'm really excited this year because I have something to compare it to because I've tracked it 2 years in a row. So without further ado, let's get into all the categories of spending for my entire life. First category we're gonna look at is housing, specifically rent, because this is where I tend to spend the most money. And this year's rent totals, as you can see, things kind of fluctuated a little bit because in February I started splitting the rent differently with Brian based on our respective incomes. So I spent a little bit less there. And then in June and July I spent less rent, and that's because, and this gets so confusing in my head, so bear with me as I try to explain it. The rent for June was like the prorated amount in my previous apartment, whereas the rent for July was the prorated amount for my current apartment, but that was the rent that was due in July, whereas typically you want to have the rent money for the next month ready in the current month so that you're not waiting to get paid in order to pay off your rent. If that completely confused you, feel free to skip by, but basically the way that I remedied this was by setting aside double the amount of rent in December, so that's why that number is twice as large as my normal rent payment. And now I'm actually in a good place with my rent where I am paying for next month's rent in the current month. Again, I'm sorry, this really confuses even me when I think about it, so if you're confused too, you can just ignore this part and take a look at the numbers. Anyway, in total, I spent $10,762 on rent for this entire year. Compared to last year, that is actually just slightly less rent than I paid. Last year I spent $10,800. So despite the fact that my rent did increase for the apartment I'm currently in, because of that like differentiated amount I was spending with Brian, I ended up spending like $40 less for the year. So pretty much a comparable amount. Then we have my car and renter's insurance, which is always very similar of an amount, but not always exactly the same. So this month, for the first part of it, I was paying $82, and then after we moved, it increased to $85. So for the entire year, I spent $999 on my car and renter's insurance. Compared to 2020, again, a very, very similar amount. I spent $1,012. So I'm, again, just like my rent, slightly lower on that fixed cost. Then let's take a look at my utilities next. This was an area in my budget that definitely went up, and the reason is certainly because I moved. In my last apartment, we didn't have to pay for water, so that was one bill that we just didn't worry about. So in addition to getting that bill added, we also just use more energy here. We have our washer, dryer, and a dishwasher here, which is something we didn't have in unit in our previous apartment. And we used to just have like window units, and we just sort of like utilized them honestly pretty sparingly. Now we have centralized AC and heating and a much bigger space. Our space has a loft area and really high ceilings, so it just costs more to heat or cool it. So this year in total, it was varying amounts every month, but we ended up spending $898 on utilities. Again, just like rent, this is my half of the utilities, so it represents half of the total cost of this apartment. Obviously, Brian pays for the other half. Last year, I only spent $523 on utilities, so we saw an increase of almost $400 this year. With that one, I don't really have any emotions about it. It just sort of is what it is in terms of how we're paying to comfortably live in our space. That's not really something, I mean, we're very conscious about like what temperature we turn the AC or heating to, if we're actually having the thermostat on or not. We've always been very energy conscious in that way, but we're not really trying to scrimp and save. We're just trying to be thoughtful consumers. Now let's take a look at groceries. So this year, all things considered, and for this, this honestly goes for all of the categories, when it comes to December, I just put the amount that I have budgeted to spend on these things. I haven't reached that $220 yet, but I'm anticipating that I'll be around there, obviously. So groceries this year, I spent $2,346. Again, that's my half. And that is extremely similar to last year, where I spent $2,399. So once again, just like slightly lower than what I spent last year, which is nice, I guess. Again, I'm not really feeling super positive over saving those $50. But it is good to see that it's been very consistent, and you know, that I am being really conscious about that lifestyle inflation piece. And then we have my going out money. This is mostly dining, but it also includes, like, if I'm going out to bars, it includes Ubers and things like that I don't do all too often, but sometimes, as well as concerts, things of that nature. So this year I spent $2,609 on all of those items, compared to last year. Wow, in 2020 it was really low. I only spent $1,983. So that actually increased quite substantially. Looking at it, it increased by about $600. If I had to venture to guess what caused this discrepancy, I would probably say it's just that for most of 2020 we didn't eat at restaurants and things like that, and so as I, have sort of reintroduced myself into the outside world, just depending on the state of the pandemic and things like that, I must have just ended up spending more money this year. Again, not feeling necessarily positive or negative about that, very neutral, and just sort of trying to take this analytic stance. I would guess that that's probably what it is. Similarly to that, let's take a look at my gas, because this definitely increased this year since I've been actually driving more. So in total for 2021, I have spent $849 on gas, which honestly is pretty low, especially since moving, my commute is far, far shorter, so I fill up my tank way less frequently. But in 2020, before I started commuting to work again, there were many months I spent $0 on gas, and the rest of the months I really didn't spend that much either, so I only spent $310 on gas in 2020. So that increased by about $500, and obviously very reasonably. I do expect that to decrease next year, as next year will represent like a full year of me living really close to where I work. So this is just sort of that evening out. Then we have my phone bill, which is the exact same as last year. It's $45 a month, and so a total of $540. My subscriptions as well, which for most of the year were about $10 and recently decreased to just $6. That's only $112 for 2021. Last year it was $289, because that was the last year that I think I paid for, I want to say it was like the Amazon Prime subscription that I ended up canceling because I don't support Amazon. So a little over $100 decrease there. And then we have Hattie's costs. So in 2020 I started setting aside about $70 a month, beginning in July, totaling $424 spent on her. This year I was setting aside $70 a month, and then in October I decided to start classifying her costs as a sinking fund, like just putting that money aside every month and then pulling from that fund when there was something to purchase for her. So I stopped counting that as a separate category, and then it started just going into my savings, which we'll get to I think next. So I'm still putting aside that $70 a month. It's just categorized elsewhere for October, November, December. So this year, $630 specifically to Hattie. And then we have my other fund. So this year in total, I spent $3,091 in the other category. This is the category where like I replace items of clothing. This is any makeup I buy. This is any household items I buy. Things that don't fit into the grocery budget or the going out fund. So more of the purchases that are just for me, whatever those may be. Last year, I only spent $1,745 in this category. So this did increase by quite a lot, by about $12,000. Also, when I'm talking about these increases and decreases, I am just literally doing the mental math. So if my approximation is slightly off, it is probably just like a little mental math mistake. But yes, that increased by quite a bit as well, in addition to that going out fund increasing and gas and utilities and stuff. And I can't really speak to exactly why that is. I think it might have just been that like I had a little bit more money to work with as my income increased and as I got like lump sums through my stipends and tax refunds and stuff, but I'm not entirely sure exactly what it is. I guess just a little bit of lifestyle inflation there as well. Okay, so here is where things get interesting. As you've seen so far, my costs have been mostly consistent. In many categories, they've been almost exactly the same or slightly decreased. A couple categories, they've gone up. The category where there has been the most difference this year is my midterm savings category. Now, I do count this as an expense. So I do count this as money that I am spending, even though it's going into my savings accounts. And the reason that I do this is because it's going into those accounts to be spent on a particular thing, whether that be travel or gifts, Hattie's fund, as I just discussed, grad school, money to pay myself over the summer when I'm not working. All of that stuff is in this category. My car fund, everything. Some of this money is still sitting in my bank account, but with the plan that it will eventually be spent. So that's why I consider it a spending category and money that I've spent. Last year, looking at my totals here, I only saved $4,520 into these sinking funds. Obviously, I set aside more money in my investments, so that's something to keep in mind. But I really did not strictly save that much money in 2020. Looking at these, the most I saved in a month looks like it was about $600. All things considered for 2020, I only saved $4,520. This year, in 2021, I'll put my totals up here, I saved $14,541, which is insane. I actually don't know how I did this. I think a big piece of this was that I saved up a lot of that money to spend on the move. I am now rebuilding my car fund, which is something I have to put a lot of money into. I got a lot of stipends and lump sums of money through obviously my stipends, but also my like tax refunds and, you know, and any stimulus checks I received. And so a lot of that went to savings. And at this point, like looking at these numbers, there were 6 months when I saved over $1,000, which is pretty intense. Again, I saved this money as in I set it aside, but it is money that I either have already spent or like am planning to spend on these things. So that increased by like $10,000, which is crazy. So if you look at all my totals for this year, I spent $37,377. Again, this is intense. Last year, all my totals totaled up to only about $2,500. So this is like a $1,200 increase. Now, that being said, I think it begs an interesting question about this idea of lifestyle inflation, because the discretionary categories where I saw an increase were my other fund and my going out fund, which makes sense because those are really like the only like more, I guess, frivolous or could be considered frivolous spending categories on here. But the majority of the increase, as I said, was from my savings. And so yes, am I seeing my lifestyle inflate? Absolutely. A little bit in the discretionary categories, but like 80% of that inflation, if not more, that's just my guesstimate, I haven't actually done the math on that, the majority of that lifestyle inflation is just that I'm able to save more money than I have been in previous years. So as a result of my income increasing, it's not like I'm this frivolous spender suddenly, it's just that I now have this privilege of being able to save even more. Not saying that I wasn't privileged before, because I obviously always have been in many ways, but I just think it's fascinating because when people talk about lifestyle inflation, they're talking about, you know, your spending increasing as your income increases. But I think that there's this negative connotation to it because they consider that spending increase to be in these like frivolous ways. Oh, well, now you're eating out more, or now you're spending more money on beauty or whatever it is. Whereas in the reality, so much of this lifestyle inflation is just the ability to actually save. And I feel like that is so overlooked when we talk about this entire topic. Not that there's anything wrong with your lifestyle inflating for discretionary costs, because there literally isn't. You should be able to spend more money on yourself as your income increases. But I just think it's really interesting that we focus on this one side of lifestyle inflation and don't think about the fact that a lot of the times it's inflating in a way where you're actually just able to save more money. Okay, so those are the numbers for 2021. Quite a steep increase, but obviously, like I said, most of that being the fact that I was able to save more. Hopefully we'll continue that trend into 2022. Because I have a lot of things that I am currently saving for, including just rebuilding that car fund, fully funding my grad school fund, and then of course my other sinking funds that I'm always putting into, like gifts and travel and things of that nature. In terms of the lifestyle inflation in my discretionary categories, I feel really fine about it. Like I said, I feel like, and this is sort of a theme that kind of keeps recurring for me in these videos, but also just anytime I look at my numbers in general, and that is, you know, being able to look at and understand all of my numbers and the reasoning behind them and be intentional about the choices I'm making with my money, but ultimately not having any part of my happiness or my self-worth or my sense of self be determined by how little I spend or how much I spend. Like in general, just sort of vibing with this money and neutrality where, you know, I care and I make decisions thoughtfully and intentionally and carefully, but I'm not beholden to outcomes, and I know that these numbers only tell one part of the story and don't say anything about my goodness as a person. Which might sound bizarre to some people, but if you have had financial anxiety and trauma like I have had in my life, this is actually like the most beautiful thing ever, and I'm really, really proud of my growth in this sphere. So I hope you enjoyed seeing my numbers for 2021. I have my tracker set up for 2022, and I can't wait to keep adjusting these throughout the year. This year it was so much easier. In 2020, I collected them all at the end of the year for the video, and it took so long. Whereas in 2021, I did it month to month as I was working on my budget. And so this was like the easiest video prep ever because I already had the numbers here. I hope everybody has an amazing new year. Thank you so much. It is such an honor that you actually watch these videos, especially if you've made it to the end. Leave any questions or comments below, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!